Good morning again. Our scripture reading this morning comes from Acts chapter 10, verses 9 through 22, and I'll be using the Inclusive Bible translation. About noon the next day, shortly before they were to arrive in Joppa, Peter went up to the roof terrace to pray. He was hungry and asked for something to eat. While the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. Peter saw heaven standing open, and something like a large sheet being lowered to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of animals, birds, and reptiles. A voice said, "Stand up, Peter, make your sacrifice, and eat." But Peter said, "I can't, my God. I have never eaten anything profane or unclean." The voice spoke a second time and said, "Don't call anything profane that God has made clean." This happened 3 times. Then the sheet disappeared into the heavens, and Peter was still pondering the vision when Cornelius' deputations arrived. They had asked directions to Simon's house and were now standing at the door. They called out to ask if Simon, known as Peter, was here. While Peter reflected on the vision, the Spirit said, "A deputation is here to see you. Hurry down and don't hesitate to go with them. I sent them here." We went down and said to the deputation, I am the one you are calling for. What do you want?" They answered, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing person, respected by the Jewish people, was directed by a holy angel to send for you. We are to bring you to the household of Cornelius to hear what you have to say." Amen. During the month of November, we are talking about the 4 pillars that were created during our surveys and our listening sessions. This week, we cover the 2nd pillar, affirming and celebrating LGBTQ spiritual seekers. Why is it so important to name this pillar and to be a separate pillar from nurturing diverse and inclusive community? The reason for making this a separate pillar and naming it as one of our 4 pillars was because during the surveys and listening groups, this is something that in the surveys and listening groups, the congregation named was important. Members of this church that voted to become an open and affirming church in July of 1991 saw the importance of being a haven for spiritual seekers that identify as LGBTQIA+. This morning, I am going to share 2 stories from the past that were shared in the Pentecost Papers. The Pentecost Papers were a series of newsletters sent out by Pastor Cheryl in her last weeks here at First Congo. These papers were a way for Pastor Cheryl to share where we had come from. After we look at the history that was shared through the Pentecost Papers, I'm going to share a little of my story to talk about the present. And then I'll talk about the future and the work that is still needed to be done for future generations. First Congo, like many churches, knew of the LGBTQI+ community, knew that they came to their churches, but never really pressed the issue of being an open and affirming church until something happened that impacted one of their members. Someone they knew, someone they cared about, someone they saw hurting. Change comes when we see someone that is close to us hurting and in pain. During this time, when 2 men or 2 women came to church, it was assumed they were roommates or friends that came to church. This is true for our very own Julia Hicks, who at the time was attending the church with her kids and her partner at that time. Some might have known they were a couple, but some thought they were just roommates. The story changed when people in the congregation saw that Julia was not coming to church with her kids anymore. People in the church learned that her ex-husband had taken custody of the children, and Julia was in a long, heartbreaking battle to regain custody of her children. At that moment, a group of people in the church called the Justice Peace Fellowship decided to take action to help Julia fight for custody of her children. They started a legal fund to help Julia pay for her expensive legal fees at that time. This group, along with other members in the church, realized that there were no protections for the LGBTQI+ community to prevent what was happening to Julia from happening to other people in the LGBT community. Days before the formal hearing, the courts notified Julia that if the case came before the judge, that she would lose not only custody, but visitation rights. Julia, not wanting to lose visitation rights, signed custody over to her ex-husband. When it came to vote in July of 1991 on becoming an ONA church, Julia's story was weighing on the hearts of the members that were voting that day. They knew they needed to do something to make a change and to make a difference. This is not the only story in First Congo's history of going to battle for a member that was LGBTQ+, that was caught in a crossfire. Scott Howell, who was an openly gay man that had served First Congo as their office manager, was seeking ordination in the United Church of Christ. With the Committee on Ministry that oversaw the ordination process changed hands, Scott was given a new advisor that set out to prevent the LGBTQ+ identifying people from being ordained. Scott was now in an uphill battle to get ordained. 15 people from First Congo, including Pastor Cheryl, drove up to St. Louis to stand up for Scott and to plead his case before the Committee on Ministry, which was unheard of at that time. The results of that meeting, a couple of months later, Scott was able to be ordained and became an associate pastor here at First Congo, Reverend Scott Howell. There are many more stories like this that have been shared through the history of First Congo on its journey to becoming an ONA church, and it's continuing the work for the rights of the LGBTQIA+ community. I wanted to share Scott Howell's story because it's similar to the story for me. I know some of you have been thinking, there's this weird guy from Holy Trinity doing this internship at First Congo, but what is his story? Or what is he all about? Today, you'll get to hear part of my story. If you've been part of our Wednesday Fun with Food Justice Ministry or been part of Congo Connect, you've heard a little bit of my story. I have been actively involved in church or ministry my whole life. At the age of 15, I answered a call into pastoral ministry. I began to preach at the age of 15. When I turned 18, I was going to be licensed and get to study under a pastor, hopefully to be ordained by the age of 19. Only one problem when I went off to college at the age of 18. The attraction I had for men was a little harder to suppress in college. Word came out, and that was the end of that for me. I then went on to a different denomination and started the process again. I was working as a Sunday school teacher, a youth director, and once again, some people started to ask questions, and once again found myself back at square one. I got so frustrated with the process, I decided, well, I'll just work in the church in different ways. Moved to a whole new city and started working in the children's program. At each church I worked in, when they got to a point where people were asking too many questions or it was time to move on, I decided instead of moving on each time to another church, it was better to find work in a ministry outside of the church. That's what I did. I worked for 10 years with Muslims aged 18 to 19 in a soccer ministry program. Most Sundays I was at games with youth and kids, and then the weekends that I was not with them, I traveled as a soccer referee to soccer tournaments all over the state of Tennessee and some outside of the state to avoid going to church for fear that someone would find out my secret. Then I met my husband and moved to Memphis, leaving the work I was doing behind and excited my husband was part of Holy Trinity because I had been part of Holy Trinity Nashville when I was going to church. Then I began to process again with the United Church of Christ. I just simplified for you the road that I have traveled. There were a lot more curves, bumps, and conversations that were had. Most of them very uncomfortable conversations. I had been beaten down so many times that when I got to Holy Trinity, I was content with filling in behind the pulpit when needed, or teaching Bible study on Wednesday nights. But that was not my true calling, and I knew it. It took Pastor Rob Van Ness coming to me and saying to me, "You have a calling on your life, and I will give you the rated G version of the second part." But most know what he said to me. He told me to take care of my business or get out of the bathroom. So after so many years of fighting to be ordained, so many years of fighting to work in ministry, to have someone to believe in me, to have someone say to me, "I need you to handle your business or do what God has called you to do." And this is what I needed. I had to go back and get my undergrad, and I did that. And now I'm at seminary with only about a year left to go. And I can see the light at the end of the tunnel for the first time in my life. My story is why it's so important we have churches like First Congo and Holy Trinity that allow people in the LGBTQI plus community to grow spiritually and to be part of God's work in this world. There are so many more people just like me that are crying out for someone to say, "I believe in you." Crying out to be told you're exactly the way that God created you to be. Crying out for someone to say, "We're going to stand right here beside you and fight with you." That's why we must continue to be the church that allows people of the LGBTQ plus community to grow spiritually in our community. This brings us to our third point, the future. When I was growing up until I was in my mid-20s, I didn't see examples of support for the LGBT community. I did not have a role model as an example. There is still a lot of LGBTQ community that are homeless because they do not have anywhere to turn. There are still members of the community that are still hurting from the trauma their church created. There are still members of the community that are seeking out spiritual places to grow, looking for a community to call home, looking for that role model. And one way we can give them that role model is providing a place where they feel loved. They see people just like they are. They see leaders in the church that are just like they are. We have come a long way, but we still have a lot of work to do. In our Bible reading today, Peter is having a vision of where a sheet is being lowered. And according to the law, these items are unclean, unfit to eat. Peter says, "I have eaten unclean thing." And after the vision is over, a centurion named Cornelius had sent for Simon Peter, a Roman soldier, which in that time it was unclean and uncommon for a Jew to have anything to do with a Roman. Why is this important? Patrick Chin, in his book Radical Love, Introduction to Queer Theology, states that Jesus transcended the boundaries of the divine, social, sexual, and gender boundaries of his day. He goes on to say, indeed, to the extent the church is one body that is made up of people of many sexualities, genders, and races, we can understand that the church is a place that dissolves the traditional boundaries that divide us from one another. Just like the animals on that sheet were unclean or not common, in the society to fellowship with certain people because they were not Jewish, had a disease, or were a thieving tax collector, viewed as unclean. It was just as bad to be seen with unclean people as it was to eat unclean food. God was trying to teach Peter that through Christ, the boundaries that had been set forth by the law were no longer a boundary. The church should be a boundary breaker, not a boundary maker. James Cone gives us an example of this in his book, A Black Theory of Liberation. In view of the black emphasis on liberation, it seems not only appropriate, but necessary to define the Christian community as the community of the oppressed, which joins Jesus Christ in his fight for the liberation of humankind. The task of theology then is to explicate the meaning of God's liberating activity so that those who labor under enslaving powers will see that the forces of liberation are the very activity of God. Christian theology is never just a rational study of being God. Rather, it's a study of God's liberating activity in the world, God's activity on behalf of the oppressed. In Peter's time, those that were unclean and those that were not common were oppressed by the society that they lived in. God instructed Peter that through Jesus Christ, that they are no longer unclean or not common. The church should be a place for people that society has deemed unclean or not common. The church has done a good job of setting boundaries to keep the LGBT community out. We need to take down these boundaries. There are faithful and spiritual people in the LGBT community, just like Cornelius, that are looking for a place to go spiritually and to be a spiritual leader. As this church is pushing them out, as the church is pushing them out, and as society is pushing them out, we need to make sure that they know they have a home at First Congo. This has been the message of God for God's people. Thanks be to God. And at this time, we will now take our offering.